Hello and welcome to Math Minds, Building Thinking Classrooms. I am Melissa Bardak, the Instructional Leadership Manager at Indiana Online, and I am thrilled to join you today to share a little bit about our team and how they implemented building thinking classrooms from a book study in their online virtual environment. A little bit of background, our program is a fully online program for students in grades 5 through 12. We have students that are fully virtual and also students who are taking supplemental classes. They may be taking one course while they are all still enrolled in their brick and mortar setting. So to give you a little bit of background, our teachers all read the book Building Thinking Classrooms in Mathematics Grades K through 12 by Peter Liljedahl. We also use the compendium Modifying Your Thinking Classroom for Different Settings, which was a supplement to Building Thinking Classrooms and really dives into providing the same resources and information in an online environment, whether blended, asynchronous, or synchronous. Peter Liljedahl is a professor of mathematics at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. He has studied the student experience adapting to a progressive classroom and really explores how previously set norms in an education system have interfered with student thinking and learning. And what Peter dives into in his book is how students have been trained to mimic based on how we present our information as teachers. So typically in a school that is following institutional norms, you may see a teacher give instruction. Students then listen and mimic the information that they have been given by their teacher when it is time to show performance or their own individual learning. Peter identifies 14 variables that impact thinking in a classroom. So with that, we are going to share how our math teachers took building thinking classrooms and implemented these 14 variables. We're really going to focus on the variables that cover instructional strategies and practice. We are still in the learning phase, and we did not get into the last few variables that talk about evaluation and assessment. So in this, we will share our lessons learned, our tips for implementation in an online and virtual environment, and just a little bit more about ways that you can build thinking classrooms in your space. So Laura Wheeler has this amazing sketch note from Building Thinking Classrooms that really outlines all of the 14 variables and gives a little bit more information in the Cliff Notes version. And we're going to dive into these first, starting with thinking tasks. Peter says in his book that thinking tasks are problems allowing students to get stuck and hit that what do I do next moment throughout the book. It's really an opportunity for students to experiment and learn how to problem solve. And so with a thinking task, we are providing as their teacher an opportunity for students to troubleshoot and solve problems without guiding them towards how to solve the problem and without giving the answers right away. So in a thinking task, students may have answers that may or may not be correct as they begin thinking and working through these higher level problems. These concepts could be applied to other content areas outside of math, but all thinking tasks need to be engaging regardless of whether a student has a previous experience. And some of our engagement strategies are using words or phrases that come from a student's everyday lives. So are we talking about something that our students can relate to or something that they find interesting in math? Even just looking at the labels that we're using, are these terms that our students are aware of or that they're going to be more interested in? In our online environment, we started with some thinking tasks that were non-curricular. So just to start getting the ball rolling, we started with non-curricular tasks and then eased into some more curricular tasks that you can see here from one of our middle school teachers. Her first task was, what patterns do you notice from the images on the screen? And in this example, students were able to just put up their thoughts and ideas, what they noticed, and the entry point for students really ranged from the number of sides and the number of angles to solving more complex mathematical equations within each triangle. Another example that shows a lot of engagement for students is, which pool would you rather have? Would you rather have the pool on the left or the pool on the right? And so these are just a couple of examples of some entry thinking tasks that we used in our virtual classrooms. Lastly, we asked for students to reach out and share what they found interesting. And from that, we built out a board game thinking task. And in this, students were asked to mix and match and meet exactly the writing that you see on the screen. Which two games would they buy if they could buy one and get a second 25% off, or buy two and get a third 50% off, and how much would you spend? So in these thinking tasks, students are engaged just by the content that they're seeing on their screen, and also using their math skills or their content knowledge that's being applied. With thinking tasks, we had many lessons learned. The first one was to model again for students what a thinking task should look like. What are the expectations for thinking tasks when working through a project such as this? And when we started with non-curricular thinking tasks, it was a lot more achievable for students because there was not the pressure or the expectation of their academic skill. And we started with things such as which doesn't belong. And it may have been cereals and breakfast foods or fruits and vegetables, things that were pretty easily separated into which of these doesn't belong, and explain your thinking. Then we built up into items that could be sorted in a variety of different ways, and then gradually built into some curricular thinking tasks. What we also learned from this was that structure and having those non-curricular thinking tasks from the start is definitely the way to go. With a couple of our teachers that started straight in with these fantastic higher level thinking problems, they had to circle back and go to some of the non-curricular just to help with students' comfort level and ease and willingness to participate and understand the practice. So providing that structure for students of how we're going to complete a thinking task to be successful with the activity. It was a mind shift for everyone. Students are very comfortable asking for help and getting answers from their teachers. And with a thinking task, the goal is really to see their thinking and have students walk through their process, whether it's by themselves or with each other. This was a mind shift. It was also a mind shift for our teachers who were thinking about ways that they could address questions, but knowing that they really needed to let students think out loud and overcome their struggles. We learned that students enjoyed the group work. For the most part, they really enjoyed being paired with their peers and collaborating and working together. There was engagement through the topics, and students truly enjoyed having these opportunities to understand their thinking, work with their peers to bounce ideas off of each other, rather than being told by one of us exactly which way to solve the problem. Liljedahl says in his book, and he found from all of his research, that whether strategically grouped or self-selected, 80% of students entered their collaborative groups feeling like they were going to be a follower rather than a leader before they ever entered the group. And he said they're going to be a follower rather than a thinker. So students being put into groups have this preconceived notion that someone else will be the leader, and their job and their role is to really just follow along and do whatever is told of them. So a variable and one way to work with this was to create collaborative groups that were visibly random. And visibly random really meant sharing with students and letting students see that they were in fact random groups. The optimal size from the research for grades 3 through 12 was 3 students in a group. For grades younger than 3rd grade, the optimal size there was a partner team, just having 2 students in a group. The optimal size being 3 for grades 3 through 12 really helped ensure that all students were taking a part, and there were times where one person would want to take the lead over the 3, but there was always, that 3rd person kind of saying, no, we want to share our ideas also. Many of the benefits included that willingness to collaborate. With more and more practice, our students had a willingness to work together, and they wanted to be paired into groups so that they could work with their peers and collaborate together on their learning. It did over time eliminate the social barriers between our groups. Many of our students who may have had their camera off, they may have continued with their camera off, but would start participating in the chat the more that this practice was put into place. It helped with knowledge mobility and being more flexible with their peers. I would also say that there was a lot more empathy here when students were working together. They were showing an understanding of each other with an increased enthusiasm to learn. When they're working together and they understand that their peers are with them to have the same learning experience as them, there was more energy tied to the task. And then a reduced social stress. So again, I mentioned that a student would start participating in the chat, who typically would be more of a sit and listen participant in class. But in these collaborative groups, we saw students who had reduced social stress and that need to participate. Lessons learned from our collaborative groups was to start this practice right off the bat. And the random worked for us occasionally. There were times where our groups didn't quite make the mark, and students were perfectly content sitting and working on their own. And with that, just building in some structures and some expectations with your groups was very helpful. We did find that while collaborative groups, when setting up a thinking classroom, should start from the beginning of your session or your semester, when initiating collaborative groups within a lesson, we found it important to give work time first before sending students into their groups. This allowed students time to think through the task or the process on their own and have some ideas before they walked into a setting with a random group to then share their ideas. In a virtual environment, utilizing the breakouts worked extremely well for our students. Our teachers monitored by going room to room and checking in with each group, looking to see if hints or extensions or thinking questions needed to be answered. But overall, it gave those groups time to work as a group without their teacher, but also have the teacher accessible for support if needed. The workspace kind of paired with our visibly random groups, and this was an area that we focused on quite a bit. How could we take our random groups and also utilize the workspace that was recommended in building thinking classrooms? So Laura Wheeler, again, has these amazing sketch notes sharing out visibly random groups in her math class from Peter's book. And with this, having your random groups engaged and working in the class on a workspace that is vertical and non-permanent. He references VNPS, vertical non-permanent surfaces, are extremely beneficial for multiple reasons. One of them is that as a teacher, you can see each of the surfaces that students are working on, whether it's in a virtual environment or a brick and mortar setting. Another is that all students are able to see the workspace at one time. So in our virtual setting, we used various different whiteboards or collaborative virtual tools for students to write all of their answers or to work through their thinking. From the suggestions given in the book, we found that these were some helpful tips. Only one person is writing or scribing at a time. but that responsibility moved throughout the group. So if student 1 is writing down an idea, then they pass on the writing ability or the writing turn to student 2, and then again to student 3. One trick with this is that the writer cannot write their own ideas, but rather write down the ideas or the suggestions of their peer in the group. So this truly helped ensure that each member had an idea on the vertical non-permanent surface and on the board, and also that each individual was being heard in their thinking process. We also shared that it was important to have an understanding and value the incorrect work. And this is where that modeling comes into place yet again, showing students that incorrect work has a purpose, and what can we learn from something that wasn't quite solved or approached in a way that gave us the correct answer. So with these workspaces, we used various different tools, and Peter Liljedahl shares in his book some of this research. The time on task from a vertical non-permanent surface, or time to start a task, was 12.8 seconds. Whereas with a student at a horizontal surface or a notebook, ranged from 13 to 14 seconds. What I found interesting was the time on task while using these vertical non-permanent surfaces that were visible to all students. With a vertical non-permanent surface, there were 7.1 minutes on task, and only 3 minutes with a vertical permanent surface, or 3.4 minutes with a notebook. So this really shows that students were engaged in the task when all students could see and share in that learning experience. A few of the tools that we use were Zoom, Canva, Jamboard, and Nearpod. There are so many different collaborative tools available. Within Zoom, we use whiteboards. Within Jamboard through Google, our students were having collaborative conversations and working collaboratively on the same document. It was really just a great way to pick the tool that works best for you and your students to have that shared workspace. For us, the shared workspace also kind of plays into furniture arrangement. In the brick and mortar setting in this section of the book, the furniture arrangement suggestions are to defront the classroom and have students shake up their cognitive understanding of where forward facing is. So as the teacher, are you moving around? Are you walking the room? Are you standing in what may be deemed as the back or the middle, to kind of help shift and shake up that cognitive thought process a little bit? For us in a virtual setting, we can defront the classroom in a way just by sharing different virtual settings for students, shifting up the way that we join a meeting, and then the organization of our virtual space. So in a virtual setting, having your resources accessible to students, being able to have students identify where they go to turn in their work, where do they go to access their content and their resources. We do onboarding with our students at the beginning if they are full-time to discuss the physical space that they work in. Do they have a workspace to set up their computer? Do they have a chair and a desk or a table, someplace to sit and stay focused that is strictly for their schoolwork? And this helps students stay focused and stay working in their environment. With that furniture arrangement and workspace comes how you are working. So for our students, there were many times where we tested out having our students stand during a virtual meeting, and that kept students engaged. It was a little bit more challenging for a student to be off task when they're standing and physically engaged in the online lesson. We saw a lot of success with this, but a lesson learned was that students couldn't stay standing for more than 5 to 8 minutes at a time before just the idea of looking for something else to do while you're standing kind of kicked in. So keep that in mind if you're looking at getting students up and standing and engaged in their activities, that there is also a time limit on that for students. One thing that we researched when looking through building thinking classrooms was how many questions teachers answer in a day. And the answer to that, as far as questions asked and answered in a day, is 200 to 400 questions in a day. Now, teachers make more than 1,000 decisions in a day, but when it comes to answering asked questions, the answer there is 200 to 400 questions in a day. And Liljedahl breaks it down into 3 different types of questions. Proximity questions, which are you're in the breakout room, you are standing near a student. When are we going to lunch? What are we going to do next? Those are your proximity questions that wouldn't necessarily be asked if you weren't in the physical or the virtual space, the same space as the student. There's also stop thinking questions, and the stop thinking questions are really students looking for confirmations or affirmations in their workflow. We're on the right track, right? That might be a stop thinking question, or this is the next step, right? Where a student is just looking for that confirmation to move forward, but it does stop the flow of their thinking. The student is stuck and they aren't quite sure, they need validation before moving forward. And then there's the keep thinking questions that students are asking. And these questions are students who are showing engagement in the content. They're asking clarifying questions. They're asking about the workflow and the process that they're going through to solve this problem. And they're doing more of a think aloud when they're working through a thinking task or a content question. With those questions, it's important to think about the when, the where, and the how. So how can we limit the proximity questions? And that may be, smiling and acknowledging that a student asked a question, but moving forward. We found that it was best when we shared the expectation that if you ask a question that is something you can easily find the answer to, I'm not going to answer that for you. So setting that expectation and then following through with that consistently was really beneficial. The other was the stop thinking question, and that really came to knowing and understanding your students and their needs. There are some students who at a frustrational level need that confirmation or affirmation. However, with those, it's recommended that those are answered with an additional question. Well, what do you think about that? Or what could you do next? Or if you move next, if you made that next step, what would the end result be? So that the student is moving forward in their thinking on their own and giving themselves their own affirmations. The keeping thinking questions are really where we wanted to spend most of our time for those students who are engaged in the content and to help keep students engaged in the content and the learning process. So as far as implementation of all of these different pieces that we've talked about so far, in a virtual setting, we were limited as far as the time of day that fit our schedule. However, we made a huge shift in our lesson, and instead of walking in and teaching the lesson and providing all of the information first, we began our lessons with the thinking task at the start of the lesson each day. So students came into the virtual room and they knew that there was going to be a thinking task there for them to start thinking through on their own, to start working through. And it really helped kick off each lesson pretty well. Students knew the expectation after a lot of modeling. And with a thinking task, we did begin with verbal directions. In the book study, we learned that too much input for students, just like adults, can be overwhelming. And if you are giving the verbal directions the first time that students are seeing the text, it can be a lot of input. And the moment those words were up on the screen, our students were either reading or listening. They weren't doing both. So as teachers, when we began with verbal directions, we found a lot of success, but then we followed up with the written directions coming behind. Again, we utilized those breakout rooms, but we did minimize that input for students with our notes and our words and the knowledge. So keeping a really brief breakdown of what the expectation was for students was key in making sure that all students were able to understand what the task was. We often had students who were coming late to a meeting or who were booted out of a meeting and needed to come back on. So it's important, if you are minimizing your input, to be sure that anyone who arrives late or who may come in and out of your space still has all of the same information that makes sense in getting started in the task. We then took a look at homework and what does thinking homework look like in any setting, but for us, especially in a virtual setting. And with homework, you have these pie charts that you see on the right, that a bulk of our kids didn't do it, or they did it with the help of someone else or through a tool that maybe they should not have been using, and plagiarized or cheated. And only a few did this completely on their own, or without mimicking notes that came strictly from the lesson. That was for graded assignments when students knew that there was pressure sitting on the homework. On an ungraded homework, something that had a lower kind of, I'm not going to say buy-in, we'll talk about buy-in in a moment, but they knew that there wasn't as much pressure on the homework. We still had a really big chunk of students that didn't do it. We still had a really big chunk of students that got some help. Not as many cheated. They did it on their own and they still did it without mimicking notes, and that increased. But overall, the homework there, we found if you were grading or not grading, was a little bit more of a challenge to get out of it what we were expecting from students. So when building thinking classrooms, the recommendation is that students have check your understanding problems. At the end of each day, you've started your thinking task, you've clarified with that direct instruction as you've moved through your lesson, and at the end of your course for that day, students have check your understanding problems. And that could be 3 to 5 problems where students are able to choose the appropriate level of questioning for them. We did see students who chose the easiest one every single time. But after a few weeks and after, a lot of lessons learned that we are going to continue growth in our courses, students began choosing more appropriate questions to solve as they choose your understanding problems. We also had really frank discussions about what is important with our learning and how do we know if we are hitting and making our own benchmark goals. It was suggested from the book that it is not collected or marked, but the solutions are provided when students return the next day, and discussion occurred around students bringing in that solved problem. What we ended up finding most successful was somewhat of a flipped environment. So for us in our virtual setting, the flipped environment where students were taking their learning and working through some problems on their own and coming back the next day with 2 to 3 questions that they had. And they could have been on the problems that were there, solving them. I got stuck on this step. How can I move forward? Because this was the error I kept getting. It could also be an extension of, I understood this, but what if? What if we did this with fractions? What if we did this with decimals or percentages? So moving beyond the standard that was there, but coming with those wondering questions from the get-go and the start of each lesson. Each of these pieces led to some student autonomy. With all of this, you kind of see it's student-led, it's student driven, with a teacher as the facilitator, beginning with those thinking tasks and then clarifying misconceptions and helping solve those thinking tasks moving throughout each unit. So students are making their own choices daily. How am I going to solve this? What are my next steps going to be? They are actively and passively interacting within their groups. When they're writing on their vertical surfaces, they are talking through their problem and sharing ideas. And here's what I think the next step should be. And here's why, and justifying their answers to their peers. With that same vertical space, the learning was visible. We could see, a student had one step on the board and they would scribble it out and start another way, or they'd cross out digits and correct themselves. So that visible learning was very clear and distinct for everyone who walked into that space. The teachers were fostering that learning process, not necessarily dictating each step of the learning process, but fostering the growth and the, again, autonomy for students. With all of this, for each step to be successful, modeling modeling, modeling. Our teacher said repeatedly, it didn't work well this time, but I went back and modeled. And we did this a few times together with me modeling what it could look like or what it might look like. And after that, students had a really clear understanding and they enjoyed moving through a thinking task before their direct instruction. And also the relationships with our students was a very key component in each one of these activities. Understanding your students, understanding where their frustration might be and might come from, understanding what engages these students. Having an engaging thinking task, having an engaging lesson comes from knowing your students and what their interests are and what they find important in their everyday life and experiences. Hints and extensions. So we talk a lot about asking those questions and which questions do you answer and move forward from. But with extensions and hints being one of the variables in building thinking classrooms, if you're looking to extend a student learning, wherever their entry point may be, keep increasing the challenge in small increments. So moving a student from point A to, or point 1 to point 5 may be a bit of a challenge, but if you take steps from 1 to 2 to 3 and doing that in smaller increments, we found that the frustration was low and it really helps stay in the flow that you see in the graphic on your screen. So managing the flow with frustration and boredom, but also meeting students at their challenge and ability level is really important. And that's how teachers helped facilitate and foster student growth. Pacing with that was key. Making sure that if a group was ready to move forward at a quicker speed, that those increases and increments that were given to students or the next level were available at an appropriate time, but also not moving at a speed for students who are more in the frustrational level that it just pushed them further into the lower piece of their flow. Writing the task for students, having students write down their task and write out their thinking on those vertical non-permanent surfaces was key. It really showed where the extensions could be for teachers to help facilitate that growth. It also helps students talk through their thinking. I'm going to make these changes because, I'm going to do these steps because, or their peers may ask, why did you do this? Or how did you get there? One thing that we also did was share vertical non-permanent surfaces for the same task with other groups to see if the groups could understand the workflow. And if they didn't, what questions did they have? This is a great small increment to help students build their higher level thinking skills and their learning knowledge of the content area. For students who are hitting that frustrational level and needing hints, it's important with your hints to look at, are you decreasing the challenge for students or are you decreasing the frustration? So there are students who are frustrated just simply because it is a challenge, and students who are at their frustrational academic level. So when you're giving hints, be sure that you're looking for hints that are truly useful to students as they're progressing and not just simply that they're frustrated with completing the task and having to think around their skill and ability level. And the last variable that we really focused on as we were just starting to practice these building thinking classroom strategies was consolidation. So instead of starting your summary at the end of your lesson, when you've given all of your direct instruction and you've worked through problems with students, instead of beginning at the most advanced level, the highest level thinking question that you've thrown out for this standard, start with a question that has solutions that all students in your class would be able to complete. So in Peter Liljedahl's book, he talks about the entry point and what is the entry point that all students have when they're entering the standard or these questions, and begin there. This gives all students that feeling of success, and then you can build upon in building blocks those skill sets. Gallery walks, so that students are able to see the thinking process of their peers. Think aloud was another strategy that we used quite a bit. It allowed all students at all entry points to see something that, hey, I identify with this strategy, but I also understand the next step now. I'm able to extend my learning in that way. And then ask students, but also have them ask each other for the explanations of their peers' thinking. So tell me a little bit more about this. How did you get here? And we found that providing sentence stems for all students, various levels from 5th to 12th grade, was really crucial in students being able to have those quality conversations about the learning. Keeping students up and moving. I mentioned having students up and standing in a virtual environment. This really was beneficial in keeping students engaged, physically engaged, helped keep them mentally engaged and cognitively engaged in the task. So varying we're going to stand up for this. Okay, have a seat. Let's talk through this. Okay, stand back up. We're going to get started with this next step. It was really beneficial to all of our students, and it helped consolidate that learning and help students focus on what was key in the moment. So those were our takeaways from Peter Liljedahl's book, Building Thinking Classrooms in Mathematics. And if you have any questions or you would like access to the PowerPoint that you see on the screen, please use the bit.ly or the QR code. If you have any questions, you can contact me with my information on the screen. We are just getting started with Building Thinking Classrooms, and we are so thrilled with what we are seeing and excited to begin implementing these strategies and these processes from the beginning of our school year this coming August. We are also looking at expanding into the last few variables that Peter talks about in his book, which are about evaluation, formative assessment, and grading. So those are some of our big conversations and next steps at Indiana Online in our math classrooms. And we are thankful that you took the time today to listen to our key points and takeaways. And I hope you have a wonderful day.